Hello. Yes, that is true. There is a Jerry Springer the Opera. It is British. I highly recommend checking out the videos of that online. It's very bizarre. Hi, everyone. My name is Chloe Condon. Today I'm going to be talking about logging and errors and metrics, oh my, and how they work with our Angular applications and just how we use all of those three things together to really have a full visibility into our applications. So a little bit about myself, although that was a wonderful intro. I'm a developer evangelist at Sendry. Has anybody out there used Sendry before, Sendry.io? Awesome, yay, we're an open source product, so I'm sure a lot of y'all have touched it before. I'm a non-traditional background engineer, as was mentioned in my introduction. I come from the theater world, so there's going to be a lot of gesturing and a lot of puns and jokes in this talk, so please feel free to laugh or I will feel very awkward. I am a Hackbright graduate, mentor and an ambassador. That's an all-female software engineering school in San Francisco, and I'm also a blogger, and I'm at Chloe Condon on most things, just my name if you want to tweet during this. I love when people tweet me. And if you're trying to place, like, oh, she looks kind of familiar, I wrote an article called What It's Like to Be a Woman at a Tech Conference. I'm the woman making kind of the bizarre, bland face like this in front of a big group of men. So definitely check that out to get an insight into what that might be like, although I am so happy that there's so many diverse people and women in this audience. It's wonderful. So let's get on to the real agenda here. So what's on the agenda? Why do we need metrics? Also, why do we need logs? And why do we need error tracking? Isn't that the same thing? Spoiler alert, it's not. And that's a lot of stuff. Do we really need all three of those things? Are you sure? Yes, I am sure. So before I dive a little deeper into each of these topics, I want to give you a little background of the origin of this talk. So I work at Sendry, and as I mentioned, we provide open source error tracking for multi-platform, including Angular. And we collect errors, and we aggregate them, and we kind of provide the tools to prioritize them and identify them and fix all of the issues in there. So it started as a little piece of open source code, and it's expanded into a very big thing. And as a developer evangelist at Sendry, I get to talk to a lot of developers out in the wild, be it at a conference or meetup or in the line for brunch for 2 hours in San Francisco, because that's actually a thing. I can't believe it is. The most common question that I get is, wait, isn't error tracking the same thing as logging? Or why do I need something other than my logs to have an insight into my errors? Can we just look in spikes in our metrics for that? Or my personal favorite, how do I get some Sentry socks? That's a pretty popular question, which I brought some with. If you catch me later, I'll give you some Sentry socks. But the point being that a lot of people still don't really understand the difference between their logs and monitoring and metrics, but also some people don't understand that they can and they should be using different tools to solve different problems and to get different insights into our application, and kind of use those together to help find and diagnose these issues. So this talk is going to dive into a couple of these different areas. So to start, logging, monitoring, and metrics, and I kind of want you to walk away with a better sense of what each of these is, and then how to use each one specifically for the different things you want to achieve, to have complete observability of your Angular applications. So let's see. So here's a very scientific visualization of that. I'm very proud I made this GIF, y'all. Okay, here we go. Logging, monitoring, metrics, whoa, awesome, observability. So you really need the power of all of them to have full insight into that. If you want a copy of this GIF, I'll tweet it out after the talk. I'm an artist. So let's start with logging. So logs help answer the question, when did that happen? And the fun thing about logs is they oftentimes just kind of feel like background noise in our application, but they become incredibly valuable to us when issues arise and we need to retrace our footsteps of our users. So a quick show of hands. How many people, after a long day of coding, go home, maybe pop open a nice bottle of wine or LaCroix, and then just look through all of their logs for the day? Yeah, I didn't think so. No hands. If there is a hand, we should definitely talk after. So you shouldn't have to do that. You shouldn't have to sit down and read through all your logs. They're a great way to dig into issues and figure out what the cause of an issue is, but we shouldn't be scanning them every day on a daily basis. That would be ridiculous. So should you get rid of your logs? No. Are they useless? No, their logs are great. They solve a lot of mysteries in our code. They dive into user behavior. And so using kind of an error tracking tool and metrics along with this, you'll be able to have a full insight and use your logs to their full potential. But logging is invaluable to us as developers, so let's jump into why. So I recently heard a talk from Jess Rutter at RubyConf. She's awesome. Definitely check her out on the internets. And she talked about failure. Personally, I really love talks about failure because as engineers, we fail all the time. I failed trying to cook the perfect keto waffles at home. I failed to go to the gym this morning because I was finishing up a project. But we all fail a lot. And in Jess's talk, she mentioned a fun fact that I'm not aware of. So in the world of aviation, everything is documented. Everything, no matter how minor it is. And in her talk, she recalled a situation where she was out with an instructor flying a plane. I know, she's awesome. And when they landed, they discovered an issue with one of the wheels. They didn't crash or anything. It was just kind of weird sounds, weird engine noises. And she was really confused and felt for a second that she was in trouble because her instructor said that she would have to fill out a report. If something weird, if we have an issue with our car and something sounds weird, we don't have to fill out a report. That would be very, it seems very frivolous to us. So a report kind of makes us feel like we're in trouble, but it can seem kind of overkill when these crashes are happening every day. Oh, there, I put a little helmet on her. So here's the thing. As I mentioned before, in aviation, everything is documented. Every flight is documented. Every plane has a black box that consists of an FDR, which is flight data recorder, and a CVR, which is a cockpit voice recorder. And every accident, no matter how small, is reported. And this allows engineers to design safer planes, and it's all thanks to these logs. So there's a significant amount of evidence that shows that doing this is extremely beneficial, and that's very similar to our applications. So in my early days of learning to code, logging seemed very frivolous. It just kind of felt like, I was building very small applications when I first started, mind you, but it kind of seemed like a scrapbook. Like I was keeping track of everything that was happening in there, like, oh, baby's first user, baby's first mouse click, maybe baby's first Firefox browser user. But let's take a second and think about those benefits of aviation dotting their I's and crossing their T's with that constant documentation and reporting. So for one, the data allows the airline industry to constantly iterate on it. And that's something that we as engineers, that's something very important. And also, they can update and change airline safety policies, protocols, and design. So here is an example of that. So I'm not sure if any of you remember this story, but an airliner with about 144 passengers flew 600 miles as its pilots slept at the controls for more than an hour. Spooky, I know, I'm not trying to scare you from getting on another plane. But the pilot and the co-pilot were believed to have nodded off as the plane flew in autopilot for 37,000 feet, and it caused an overshoot of its destination by 150 miles. That's kind of over the top. So in the meantime, there were all these F-16 fighter jets that were readied and they were ready to shoot down the jet over fears of it being hijacked. But the pilots insisted that they were engaged in a heated discussion about airline policy. And, right, sounds like something two sleeping pilots would say if they fell asleep. But by the time their discussion had ended, or they had woken up, the plane was 150 miles off course and flying to the neighboring state of Wisconsin. So how was it discovered that these pilots were sleeping? Did they just accuse them? How did we get to that? Well, as I touched on before, in the world of aviation, everything is documented, much like our applications have logs. So in most cases, the recordings from a cockpit are probably really mundane, I imagine. Maybe like Jan, the pilot, tells Kelly, the co-pilot, about a sandwich that he had the other day and how the kids are doing. But imagine how valuable the cockpit recording for this specific scenario was. Sounds pretty similar to our logs with our applications. So they were able to track that no, in fact, these pilots were not having a heated heated debate, they were snoozing away. So that really kind of speaks to me to where these things that can sometimes seem very frivolous actually can be very useful later on. And the proof is really in the numbers with this. Raise your hand if you've ever felt nervous on a flight. I was nervous on my flight here. So as someone who travels about 2 to 3 times a month, I'm always fascinated that turbulence still makes me nervous, even though I give this talk a lot. But for whatever reason, statistically, you can think of it this way. Here's a couple different stats for you. So TLDR, you're most likely to get hurt in your Uber to the airport than you are actually being in a plane. And if you ever get really nervous on a plane, I found this application, which I highly recommend, which shows the probability in your specific flight. You can put in your number, your flight number, to get that probability. So that always makes me feel a little better. I'm passing that on to you. So after learning about the clearly positive effects of planes logging this data, I imagined this world in which humans were actually accountable for reporting any sort of car trouble, and then, or any safety issue for that matter, and then I imagined a world where people would actually follow through with that, and I lost a lot of hope because I know we wouldn't do that. So we really need that system to be automated. But what's really exciting is that with the new invention with smart cars, such as Tesla, they have bug reporting features, and drivers can just push a button on the wheel to prompt the car to report any kind of bugs or issues that they have with this, and that's logged. And then in addition to that, if there are any issues with the engine, or let's say that there's an accident, that automatically gets recorded through the technology that they've built. So this is kind of similar to how error tracking and logs work, in that we can't really rely on our users to just tweet really passive-aggressive things at us, like, hey, your app's down, or like, hey, 404, like, that's weird, because that's not really their job either. And and also, as engineers, you know, there's kind of a 50-50 chance for us of like, well, maybe it's an issue on their end, is it our end? How do you know if people are actually going to tweet you or actually send a support ticket? So you really cannot rely on users for that problem. And the cool thing about logs is we don't have to manually fill out any forms, we don't have to write any summaries. With a web application, we can kind of conveniently have that on a log file on a disk, and then 6 months later, when we're debugging an issue, we can go back and take a look at those. If you guys are familiar with Ren and Stimpy, there's no sound on this, but there's a log video that I highly recommend checking out. So to quickly touch on metrics, so metrics really help us answer the question of how many, as in how many users were affected. And also, they're a great way to just visualize what's going on inside of our application. So you can look for different spikes and drops, maybe when you're deploying, or you can define your metrics specifically. To steal a quote from our VP at Sendry, they look really great on TVs hung up around your office, those nice little dashboards that say everything's going well. So every time you release new software, you deploy an application, and something's going on the higher or lower side of this metrics dashboard, it may be time to roll back, it may be time to take a look at maybe something that's happening in there. And of course, you need to define what you're tracking. Maybe you want to monitor login failures, and maybe have a graph for that. And I want to kind of continue with this metaphor, so bear with me. Another metaphor, y'all. Oh, let's see, more emojis, okay. So previously I mentioned this idea of Tesla and smart cars being able to log all these features and have a sense of what's going on with the car itself. And we can kind of think of our metrics as what's going on the road, and what the success of our application is. So maybe we have a dashboard that shows us that crashes are up 20% in Vancouver. Okay, that's really good info to have, but we don't really know why. So we look at our logs for conditions. Oh, it's raining. That makes sense, there's a correlation there. And that would maybe motivate us to look into our logs and say, hey, that defrost option, not working so well. Visibility is not great in Vancouver, and we can iterate on that. Or perhaps we have a dashboard where we can set up specifically monitoring accidents at a specific point in our car. So we see for whatever reason, there's a huge spike in rear end accidents, and now we see that this data is incredibly valuable because it doesn't just tell us why, we can dig into our logs. Okay, oh, there's a delay with the rear-facing camera. Cool, so people are gonna be running into issues with that. Oops, let's go back 1 second. There we go. Oops, so there we go. Oh, and then let's say that randomly people keep, there we go. Okay, so maybe we make a graph for a huge number of drivers are having issues with their seat warmers. It randomly keeps turning on in hot weather, we're really unfocused while we're driving, and then you have a dashboard set up for those crashes. But you don't have to have one set up for seat warmer related crashes. Like, who can foresee such a specific issue within your car, or in our case, our applications? So, oops, more emojis. There we go. It's the magic move in these presentations. So those are kind of hypotheticals, but here's a real one that I found out while researching Tesla's bug reporting feature. So TLDR, this user is describing an incredibly specific issue, and you can take a second to read this if you'd like. It's very detailed. So again, how do we account for issues like this? Think about these issues with your application. Super specific UI issues that you're never going to know are causing issues, or accidents in this case. And let's face it, like issues like login issues could make the difference between someone using your application and someone using your competitor's application. So with an issue like this, we'd probably not see a huge spike in crashes necessarily in our metrics, but our logs would tell us that users are having this issue on a particular version of our software. But how do we get alerted of this? So that's kind of the important part of this talk. How do we group these smaller issues that are happening and get that information to the right people and get those things fixed? It's like I mentioned before, like you can kind of set up these traps maybe, assuming that this issue might happen here or there, and we can't necessarily rely on our users to report them either. I know personally I like to do a lot of rage tweeting, and by rage tweeting I mean passively aggressively tweeting that something doesn't work, but I think I'm kind of the outlier in that situation. So you can't rely on your users. So fun fact, Tesla has a voice command bug report feature that sends all the car's data when the issue is reported, but I'd be interested to know how many people actually use this or know that it's a feature. Additionally, it has a 5-second long limit, so there's not a lot of room to get really detailed in that. And testing-wise, how do we account for getting notified if things like happen? And this is one of my favorite GIFs. Dogs are awesome. That's an awesomeness of dogs GIF, going off the charts. So metrics are a great way of visualizing that data, but it really doesn't give us any context, like why are dogs awesome? Why is this? I mean, we all know why, but. So you're probably using a tool like Datadog. Oh, pun, to visualize all that for you, or perhaps you've built your own tools for this, but many of these tools have alerting, but how do you know what to alert for? So as I mentioned before, I work at Sendry. We're an open source error tracking tool. Definitely check us out. And a lot of my job as an evangelist, oops, skipping ahead too quickly here. So a lot of my job as evangelist is speaking at conferences like this and creating content, but out in the wild, I'm always surprised by how many people think that error tracking is logging or that error tracking is metrics. They are all so different. And as you can see kind of from our quick review of the first two, they're both great tools, but they both tell very different parts of the story. This next slide ended up being, spoiler alert, very relevant. I didn't realize that this was in Atlanta. So logs tell us the history of what happens, but how do we know when something bad is going to happen? I'm sure many of you have seen this tweet. If you listen to it with sound, it's very crass. Let's see if I can play it here. Oh, did it play? Was it playing? Okay, it was just going really slow. I'll play it again. There we go. So, spoiler alert. It's too tiny on my screen. There we go. So how could they have foreseen this? Like, how do you test the shot so many times, you do so many practice runs, like, how do you know? So you can write as many tests as you want, but there's always gonna be that one user who has bizarre behavior and you couldn't have accounted for it in a million billion years, so it somehow manages to throw an error. And I would love to say that we all build perfect applications, but we don't all build perfect apps. So how can you make sure that you're being alerted? So how do we harness the power of our logs and metrics? How do we get all that information to help point out these flaws in our application? So you can duct tape something together. I'm sure a lot of people have built their own tools. Maybe you've set up alerting within your logs. That's great. But when XYZ issue happens, I want to be notified. But how about those ones we don't account for? We can't rely on our users, and it's not really a great strategy because it creates a lot of what is happening, or fix your website. Very stressful. Slack messages across multiple teams. It can get very noisy. And of course, the favorite passive-aggressive tweet if they decide to tweet. But wouldn't it be nice if there was a tool that alerted of these things and gave us specific info on that and context for the surge in our metrics that just happened? And that is what error tracking is for. It helps us hone in on application-driven versus system-driven issues. So, got more emojis. They're just flying by here. All right, come on, emojis. I guess I was supposed to talk a little bit longer, so just gonna sing a song. Okay, there we go. So if you aren't using an error monitoring tool, you've likely built or are building one. You probably had a particular issue happen in your app, then you built a dashboard, or you set up an alert in your logs to alert you, and that happens again, so you don't have to deal with that again. And while that helps you avoid particular issues in the future, what about this issues that you did not account for, and realizing you have a problem with those as well? So it's kind of like this fire drill every time something new happens, and that's not a great experience for you or your user. So what if I told you that we could stop setting traps up, and we could stop duct taping all of our tools together, and we could actually, instead of having, a mouse problem sending out mouse traps, and then having an ant problem sending out ant traps, and then we see a squirrel, and we're like, what is that squirrel doing here? We can actually have something that catches all of those things, a one-size-fits-all trap for these things. So, more emojis. There we go. So what do? Do we replace our logs with error tracking? Do we ignore our metrics altogether? Chloe, did you come here to give us a demo of Sendry? No, you can ask for that after if you want. Our logs are really helping us solve a particular part of this issue. Oops, I am just trigger happy here. There we go. So I really like to think of this as kind of a developer toolbox in a sense, or since I am a woman in tech, a developer purse. So we have our logs, which are going to give us kind of the background information. That's sort of the detective work that we have to do. So here's an example of an error in Sendry. So we have the ability to play session stack directly inside of Sendry, and that really kind of plays what happened in a video, what the user ran into, and then we can kind of more confidently recreate and fix that issue. And then as far as the difference between a typical logging application and something like Sendry that kind of puts those things together is that it's putting it all in one visualization. So additionally, here's just kind of a rundown of all the info that we're getting there. And then this is the session stack integration, which is basically showing us exactly what happened. So this way we're not kind of sifting through and trying to play detective here. So our metrics really keep us up to date on the health of our application, so we can keep an eye on the systems, services, and make sure we're at a steady heart rate, so to speak. So here we go. So here is an integration that allows us to look at events alongside Datadog, so we can kind of discover those relationships between systems performance and our applications in production. So seeing those correlations really allows you to have a full visualization versus kind of hopping back and forth between the different tools that you may need to use to diagnose this. So here we go. So kind of to summarize here, there really is no one-size-fits-all tool. These three things, errors, logging, metrics, they work best when they're used together. So it doesn't replace, a tool like an error tracker, or a tool like Datadog, or a tool like Loggly is not going to replace needing the other ones. It's not going to be something that is going to be a one-size-fits-all for everyone, and additionally, having a full, the word observability really encompasses all three of those things versus each one individually. You only have partial observability if you're using one or even two of these tools. So That's all to say that these tools all exist. A lot of the tools that I highlighted in this talk and a lot of tools that I'm often blogging about really help combine those things. Sendry is an error tracking tool, and I would recommend taking a look at it. We really believe in playing well with the ecosystem, and it's not like use us versus other people. I'm really here to say, like, use all of the things. Like, please make sure that you're doing error tracking, that you're looking at your logs and you're doing metrics. So I hope you walked away from this talk with sort of a better sense of how you can use all three of those developer tools. Thanks for joining me today. I am happy to answer questions afterwards. I also have Sendry socks and stickers if anybody wants one of those. And feel free to tweet at me with any questions at Chloe Condon. Thanks, everyone.